So the other day we're in one of our dailies, and we're on the interstate, we're clipping along 70, 75 miles an hour, keeping up with traffic, and all of a sudden, as happens here in Nashville for some reason, traffic just stops, right? Like everybody just piles on their brakes right in front of us. I do the same thing. I get into the brake pedal hard, okay? And car stops. Doesn't lock up the brakes or anything. It was controllable enough that I pulled over onto the shoulder, without having to lock up the brakes or anything like that. Came to a nice stop. So I told Kathy, I says, if this was like, if you listen to internet like forums, we'd be dead right now, because there's no way these 9-inch drum brakes are going to stop this 3,500-pound car like that. And it's the truth. When a drum brake setup is working correctly, it functions as well as any discs under certain circumstances. So here's the thing. Most of the time, when somebody gets their hands on a vintage car and they're looking at what projects need to be done, almost inevitably the very first thing is they got to change to a disc brake setup. Get rid of the drums, put discs in the car. And there are certain circumstances where that does make sense. Like, for instance, repeated hard stops. So our stop on the Interstate in Nashville was a one-and-done deal. If we had to do that again, let's say within 5 or 10 minutes, there would have been a lot of brake fade, and it would have taken a lot more time for the, but we don't normally drive like that. On our daily driver type of cars, one hard stop, one panic stop like that is really all it takes. It's all we're going to deal with. But if you're, let's say, an aggressive driver, or you like to take your car autocrossing it to the track, lots of high speed, slowing down, stopping, then there's no question about it. A disc brake setup is much better. Same thing, let's say, if you live in extremely hilly terrain, where you're always going downhill. There's always these long, where you're doing a lot of engine braking and whatnot, downshifting to try to keep the car. In that case, yeah, absolutely. A disc brake swap makes a lot of sense, because disc brakes, by their very nature, dissipate heat better than drums. We're going to talk about differences in a minute. Now, for our purposes, on this car, we're finally getting around to rebuilding the front end. And while we're at it, we're going to swap from the car's original factory disc setup to a drum setup, 10-inch drums. And we're doing this for a couple of reasons. The first is that this is a drag car. The only thing it's ever going to be used for is drag racing. So that it's that one and done stop that counts. And in that case, the drum brake is more than up to the task. The two main reasons we'd make a swap like this, the backwards brake swap, is because first, there's always parasitic losses. There's always parasitic drag with a disc brake setup. The caliper keeps the pads in contact with the rotor. And the faster the car goes, the hotter this gets, the more it wants to drag. It's not a great deal. It's not like a huge amount of drag, but it's parasitic. And when you're trying to optimize a car, working with minimums, the way we're trying to optimize this, working with all of the minimums, that does make a difference. The big reason why we're making a swap is because this factory disc setup and this factory drum, 10-inch drum setup, there's an 11-pound per side difference. So we're knocking 22 pounds off the nose of this car, unsprung weight, just by making this swap. So less parasitic loss, less unsprung weight. It's a win for us. Now, let's go back and let's talk about why people seem to feel that drum brakes all around are inferior, because they're not. Most of the, the big difference is in, I guess, is heat dissipation. Like, for instance, here, the friction surfaces are exposed to air as, the airstream as it's passing under the car. So they're always going to run cooler. With the drum brake, the drum, it acts as a heat sink. There's no air passing through the brake assembly to help cool it. So that's the main functional difference between the disc brake and the drum brake. The drum brake actually has more surface area. So, here's the surface area for one pad, and here's the surface area for one shoe. So clearly, there's a lot more surface area here. But drum brakes need to be maintained, and they need to be set up correctly in order for them to work correctly. And that's the biggest problem. Most of you guys, you'll get your hands on an older car that's got drum brakes, and you'll find that when you hit the brakes, it pulls like crazy, or it takes forever to get it to stop, or one wheel will lock and the other one won't. Now, here's a few things that you need to look at before you condemn your drum brake system and say, no, this is garbage, I got to switch over to discs. So first things first is to make sure that everything's oriented correctly. You've got a primary shoe and a secondary shoe on the drum brakes. The larger shoe, this one, always goes to the back. The shorter shoe, this one, always goes to the front. Now, the return springs, very often you'll find that these return springs are played out. And what will happen is when you step on the brake, the wheel cylinder will push the shoes out to apply the brakes, but there isn't enough spring pressure to fully retract them. And so they'll be riding against the friction surface, and they'll get hot, you'll get a hot spot, and they'll want to fade. So you want to make sure that your return springs are all healthy, the correct ones, and oriented the way they're supposed to be. The wheel cylinder. The wheel cylinder is the #1 issue with drum brakes, and I'm going to show you why. A drum brake setup, unlike a disc brake setup, a standard disc brake setup, not an aftermarket one, but a standard production line disc brake setup, you've got one puck. And as this puck, and when you step on a brake, you're pressurizing this chamber, the puck moves out and squeezes the pads together, right? By dragging this side back closer to the puck. So you've got one source of action on this brake setup. On a drum brake setup, you've got two sources of action. Each of these operate independently. You've got a piston in each side, on each side of the wheel cylinder, and they operate independently. Now, here's what happens, and this is where people get screwed up, and this is why most drum brake setups have major issues as they age. Brake fluid is hygroscopic, meaning that if you let it sit exposed to the atmosphere, it'll absorb moisture from the air. Now, I have no idea what the mechanism is that this occurs, but all of that moisture, let's say you've got a loose-fitting master cylinder cover, and it's not completely airtight, and some air can get in there, and the moisture gets absorbed into the brake fluid. Well, I have no idea what the mechanism is, but that moisture will eventually find its way all the way down the lines and end up in the wheel cylinders. And what happens is you'll get rust buildup inside where the pistons are. Pop this apart. You'll get rust buildup in here. And what will happen is when you step on the brake, it'll apply one side and not the other. Or in a worst case situation, it won't apply either. But these need to slide in their bores evenly. And if you don't have that, you'll only have one shoe applying at any given time. That's a major problem. And for the most part, and that'll make it pull to one side, it'll make it grabby, it'll do all sorts of things. That's generally your major cause of front drum brake issues. Okay, so there's one other area that's trouble prone on drum brake setups if you don't know what you're doing with them. And that's the self-adjuster. So one of the benefits of discs is that they adjust themselves as they go along. As the pads wear, the puck comes out and it stays out. But you don't have that system on a drum setup. As these shoes wear, it's the job of this self-adjuster right here to take up the slack. And the way that works is that they'll wear to a point that when you step on the brakes in reverse, right? The self-adjuster works in reverse. When you step on the brakes in reverse, both shoes will shift. When they shift enough, when the wear is great enough and there's enough of a shift, this pawl right here will click, well, just like that. Okay. It's hard for me to duplicate this. So you see, that's how it takes up the slack. Now, what I've seen very common is people, these are side specific. I'll see people install the wrong side self-adjuster. So what's happening is, as this pawl comes down, it's loosening the brakes instead of tightening the brakes. You want to make sure that these things are side specific. You want to make sure you've got adequate spring pressure here and adequate cable tension here. Now on this setup, because this is going to be going on a race car, we're going to delete the whole self-adjuster setup, and we're gonna adjust these brakes manually for the least amount of drag. So what you do with that is you have the front wheel off the ground and you rotate the front wheel, and as it's rotating, you take a screwdriver from behind and you tighten this one click at a time until you barely hear scraping. As soon as you hear right as the wheel's spinning, you stop right there. That's as adjusted as you need it to be. There won't be any drag, and the shoes will be expanded enough so that as soon as you touch the brake, bam, she's going to want to stop. Drum brakes do take more maintenance. They do take more attention than disc brakes do. There's no question about it. But in certain applications, in certain circumstances, they're definitely a better choice. You know, I guess as a light-duty daily driver that sees a lot of flat level surfaces, show cars, restorations. There's nothing wrong with your drum brakes. You just want to keep up with them. Repeated high-speed stops, lots of downhill, lots of wet weather, because that's another thing too. The drum brakes, when moisture gets inside the drum, it doesn't have any way to leave. On a disc brake, the way the disc brake is set up, the pads are always sweeping the friction surfaces clean. So you'll see a lot of times with drum brakes, you go through a heavy, a deep puddle, you go to hit the brakes and like nothing happens because they're soaked. There's a tip. If you're new to these things and you're not accustomed to driving a drum brake car, when you're going through a deep puddle, ride the brake pedal as you go through the puddle, and that'll keep the friction surfaces dry. So we're halfway through the swap here. We just put a lower control arm bushing in the arm there. I'm going to have to change the proportioning valve. It's got a disc brake proportioning valve, so we're going to change that over to a drum brake proportioning valve. And I'll probably leave the master cylinder alone because I've done this swap many times both ways and never had an issue with the master cylinder, although the textbook says, yeah, you've got to change the master along with everything else. So we'll see how that goes. If the car stops straight, true, with even braking, then I'm just going to leave everything alone. Trial and error. One other thing, why not an aftermarket disc brake setup? Because there are so many aftermarket disc brake setups out there. Most of them are based on factory parts, the GM style. So for our case, it's not going to do us any good. These are just as good as any of the factory style aftermarket brake parts out there. Then you've got the ones that are specific high performance brake assemblies. They are lighter than the drums. But I tell you, man, I have had problems. I swore them off forever a few years ago. We had a very well-known brand name aftermarket setup on a friend's race car. And it was a few years old. It wasn't ancient, it was just a few years old. And we had an issue where it cracked one of the pucks in the caliper. So couldn't get a replacement puck, couldn't get a replacement caliper. They had superseded all of those parts. And in order to bring the system up to snuff, we literally had to, every single component around the spindles had to be changed. So it was like a $700 swap for something that a simple, puck replacement should have handled. So for my business, unless it's a tube chassis race car, this thing's going to go 180 miles an hour or better. The factory setup is more than adequate. So that's it. I get back to work. We get this thing back out to the track and try to keep it in one piece long enough to make a number. I'll see you tomorrow.